I still remember the weight of a pen in my hand, the soft scratch it made against lined paper, and how every word felt like it mattered more because it took effort to put it there. Before we begin, let me ask you something. If these memories feel familiar, if this slower world still lives somewhere inside you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories alive, and I'd love to know in the comments if you ever wrote a note that changed your life. Now, let me take you back to 1970s America, when communication didn't buzz in your pocket or light up your face in the dark. It lived in envelopes, notebooks, folded pieces of paper passed quietly from hand to hand. I was a young man then, and life moved at a pace that allowed feelings to breathe. When you wanted to say something important, you didn't type it and delete it 3 times. You sat down, you thought, you chose words carefully, because there was no undo button on ink. I remember sitting at the small wooden desk in my bedroom, the smell of dust, and old books in the air, a single lamp casting a warm yellow circle on the page. Outside, you could hear distant traffic, maybe a lawnmower shutting off, maybe a radio playing somewhere down the block. Writing a note felt almost sacred. Whether it was a letter to a friend, a thank you note to a relative, or a message slipped into a lunchbox, it carried a piece of you. Your handwriting revealed your mood: nervous, confident, hurried, careful. Today, messages arrive instantly, disappear just as fast, and are forgotten before the day ends. But in the 1970s, a handwritten note could sit on a dresser for years. I can still see one my mother kept. Edges yellowed, corners bent from being unfolded too many times. Back then, we didn't ask, "Did you get my message?" because we already knew mail took time, and patience was part of the deal. That waiting, it did something to us. It made connection feel earned. When the mailbox finally held an envelope with your name on it, your heart skipped a beat. You held it in your hands before opening it, feeling the paper, guessing from the handwriting who it was from. A note could smell faintly like perfume, cigarette smoke, or the house it came from. Those details mattered. In school, notes were passed carefully during class, folded into tiny squares, slid across desks when the teacher wasn't looking. "Meet me by the lockers. Call me tonight." Simple words, but they felt electric. Today, kids send hundreds of messages a day. Back then, one note could carry you for a week. And as I sit here now, in a world of glowing screens and constant noise, I realize we weren't just writing messages, we were slowing down long enough to feel them. In the 1970s, writing a note wasn't just communication, it was an act of presence. You had to be there for it, mentally and emotionally. I remember Saturday afternoons at the kitchen table, the surface worn smooth from years of elbows and newspapers. My father would be nearby, reading the paper, the smell of coffee lingering in the air, while I sat with a stack of stationery I'd bought at the drugstore downtown. It wasn't fancy, just plain paper with faint blue lines, but to me it felt like possibility. When I wrote letters to friends who'd moved away, I pictured them as I wrote. I imagined where they'd be when they read it, maybe sitting on their bed, maybe at their own kitchen table. You wrote knowing the words would travel miles and days before landing in someone else's hands. That thought alone made you slow down. You didn't rush. You couldn't. There was no send button urging you forward. If you crossed something out, it stayed crossed out. If you made a mistake, the paper remembered it. And that made every letter honest, in a way texts rarely are today. In those days, emotion had weight. When someone was angry, you could see it in sharp letters pressed hard into the page. When someone was gentle, the handwriting softened. I received a letter once from a girl I'd been seeing, written in purple ink, the letters looping and careful. I still remember how my hands shook a little as I opened it. Today, a breakup might come through a few cold lines on a screen. Back then, it came folded in thirds, the paper creased from careful hands, carrying the quiet courage it took to write something difficult instead of saying nothing at all. Notes weren't disposable. They lived in shoeboxes under beds, tucked inside books, taped to refrigerator doors. We reread them, sometimes years later, and the memories came rushing back like they'd been waiting patiently for us. In school, teachers sent handwritten notes home, and parents read them like sacred documents. A praise note could make your whole week, while a disappointed one sat heavy on your conscience. There was accountability in ink. You couldn't pretend you didn't see it. And when grandparents wrote, the handwriting itself felt like part of them, shaky sometimes, but full of care. My grandmother's notes always smelled faintly of her house soap, baking, something warm and familiar. Even now, I can close my eyes and see her writing, pausing to think, nodding to herself before continuing. Today, messages are fast, efficient, and endless, but they don't linger the same way. They don't age, don't yellow, don't carry fingerprints. In the 1970s, every handwritten note was proof that someone had stopped their day, sat down, and thought of you long enough to leave something behind. That kind of attention feels rare now, almost like a forgotten language. Handwritten notes shaped how our days unfolded in the 1970s, especially when it came to relationships. If you were dating someone back then, words were precious. You couldn't casually fire off a dozen messages before breakfast. You waited, you planned, you wrote. I remember sitting on my bed late at night, window cracked open, listening to crickets and distant cars, trying to figure out how to say what I felt without sounding foolish. The room was quiet in a way homes rarely are now. No screens glowing, no constant notifications interrupting thought. Just you, your feelings, and a blank page staring back at you. Writing forced you to understand yourself first. You learned to put emotion into sentences, because there was no other choice. When you finally folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it, there was a sense of finality. Those words were going out into the world exactly as they were. That made them honest. In high school, notes passed between classes became tiny emotional lifelines. I still remember the lockers slamming shut, the smell of cleaning solution in the hallways, the sound of shoes echoing as kids hurried to their next class. Somewhere between algebra and history, a folded note might appear in your palm. You'd feel it before you read it, that nervous little spark of curiosity. You'd wait until the bell rang, then find a quiet corner to unfold it carefully, as if opening something fragile. The words inside could change the rest of your day. I'll meet you after school. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry. Simple sentences, but heavy with meaning. In today's world, words are constant and often careless. Back then, they were rare and deliberate. Even arguments happened differently. If you were upset, you might write a letter and then sit on it for a day before sending it. That pause mattered. It cooled tempers, softened words, and sometimes saved relationships. Today, anger travels instantly, unfiltered, and damage happens fast. In the 1970s, emotion moved at the speed of the postal service, and oddly enough, that was healthier for the heart. I remember walking to the mailbox, letter in hand, feeling the weight of what I was about to let go of. The metal door clanged shut, and just like that, the message was gone, beyond my control. Then came the waiting. Days went by. Every time a car slowed near the house, you looked up. Every afternoon, you listened for the sound of mail being delivered. That waiting built anticipation, but it also built resilience. You learned patience because you had no other option. And when a letter finally arrived in return, it felt like a reward for your restraint. You opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper, savoring the moment. Those pauses, those silences between words, gave relationships room to grow. I sometimes wonder what we lost when we stopped waiting. Handwritten notes weren't just for romance or friendship in the 1970s. They were woven into everyday family life in ways that felt natural back then and almost unthinkable now. In my house, notes were how we stayed connected when we weren't in the same room. My mother left notes on the kitchen counter when she went out, her handwriting neat and practical. Dinner's in the oven. Be home by 6. Those pieces of paper carried her voice even when she was gone. I can still picture them, held down by a salt shaker or a coffee mug, curling slightly at the edges as the day went on. When I came home from school and found one waiting, it felt reassuring, like someone had been there just moments before. Today, a text might replace it, but it doesn't sit quietly in the room the same way. Back then, notes became part of the house itself. Fathers left messages near the phone, grandparents wrote reminders in careful script, and kids scribbled little apologies or explanations before heading out to play. The refrigerator door became a kind of message board, covered in notes, calendars, and handwritten shopping lists. Each one told a small story about the rhythm of the family. Even chores came with notes. Mow the lawn before dinner, written firmly but not unkindly. You read it, sighed, and did what needed to be done. There was no pretending you hadn't seen it. Notes also carried comfort. When someone in the family was sick or tired, a short message could lift the mood. Hope you feel better. I made soup. Those words, written by hand, felt warmer somehow, like they came with a quiet hug. On holidays and birthdays, handwritten cards were expected. You didn't grab one quickly and sign your name. You sat down, thought about what you wanted to say, and wrote it out carefully. I remember my parents teaching me that the message inside mattered more than the card itself. Today, greetings arrive with pre-written phrases and quick emojis. Back then, the blank space inside a card was an invitation to be real. Notes even played a role in discipline and trust. When my parents went out, they didn't leave a camera or constant check-ins behind. They left a note. It said when they'd be back and what was expected. And because it was written, it carried weight. You felt responsible for honoring it. In that quiet trust between writer and reader, character was built. Sitting here now, it strikes me how those small pieces of paper shaped our sense of home. They slowed us down, anchored us, and reminded us that communication didn't have to be loud or constant to be meaningful. Sometimes, a single sentence on a scrap of paper said more than 100 messages ever could. School life in 1970s America ran on handwritten notes in ways that younger generations might find hard to imagine. Long before emails or online portals, paper was how information moved. Teachers wrote comments in the margins of notebooks, red pen against lined paper, and you learned a lot about yourself from those few words. Good work. Try harder. See me after class. Those notes could fill you with pride or dread, and they stayed with you because you carried them home in your backpack. I can still feel the weight of those spiral notebooks, corners bent, covers decorated with doodles and names written over and over during boring lectures. Notes between students were their own quiet culture. You had to be careful, strategic. Passing a note meant folding it just right, making sure it was small enough to be hidden in your hand, and knowing exactly when the teacher's back was turned. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk and floor cleaner, the air heavy with light afternoon heat. When a note finally reached you, your heart beat a little faster. You might tuck it into a pocket to read later, saving the feeling for a better moment. Those notes often said simple things, but they mattered. Do you like me? Yes. No. Entire emotional worlds fit inside a few handwritten words. There were also notes sent home to parents, and those were taken seriously. A note folded inside a report card wasn't just information. It was judgment, guidance, and responsibility all at once. Parents read them carefully, sometimes silently, sometimes with a long sigh. You knew that what was written couldn't be unsent or softened. It was there, in ink, waiting for a response. Even announcements were handwritten or typed and photocopied, pinned to bulletin boards that students passed every day. You stopped to read because it was the only way to know what was happening. Today, notifications flash and disappear in seconds. Back then, information stayed put, and you learned to seek it out. After school, notes followed us home. Friends left messages with parents when we weren't around. Tell him I called. Phone numbers were written down and saved near the phone, not stored automatically. You learned to memorize them, or at least recognize familiar handwriting. That practice alone sharpened memory and attention. As I think back on those school days, I realize how much handwritten communication taught us about care and consequence. Words felt heavier because paper gave them somewhere to land. In a world that now moves too fast to reflect, those slow, deliberate notes helped shape who we became. Handwritten notes also defined how work and daily responsibilities flowed in the 1970s, especially for ordinary, working-class Americans like me. Offices weren't filled with glowing screens or constant pings. They were quiet in a different way, broken by the sound of typewriters, phones ringing now and then, and the shuffle of paper being passed from desk to desk. If someone needed something from you, they didn't send a quick message. They walked over or left a note on your desk, usually written in clear, purposeful handwriting. Please see me this afternoon. This needs revision. Those notes sat there, waiting patiently for your attention, not demanding it every second. There was a certain dignity in that. You could finish what you were doing, take a breath, then respond in your own time. In many jobs, handwritten memos were common. I remember receiving yellow notepads filled with instructions, their edges curled, the ink slightly smudged where someone's hand had rested too long. You read carefully because there was no follow-up reminder coming. You were expected to remember, to take responsibility. That expectation shaped work ethic in a quiet but powerful way. Even scheduling depended on paper. Meetings were written on calendars hanging on the wall or sitting open on desks. If a change happened, someone physically crossed it out and wrote a new time. You couldn't pretend you didn't know. Outside the office, handwritten notes guided everyday errands. Grocery lists were written at the kitchen table and folded into pockets before a trip to the store. I can still picture the aisles of the local supermarket, the hum of refrigeration units, the smell of fresh bread near the bakery section. Shoppers walked slowly, list in hand, checking off items with a pencil. That list was the plan. Lose it, and you relied on memory. Today, phones suggest what to buy and remind you what you forgot. Back then, your own handwriting did the job. Even service businesses relied on notes. Repairmen left handwritten receipts. Doctors wrote appointment reminders on small cards. Mechanics explained problems in quick notes that smelled faintly of oil and metal. Those little pieces of paper carried trust. You kept them, sometimes for years, tucked into drawers or glove compartments. They told the story of your life's routines. Now, so much of that record is invisible, stored somewhere we rarely see. Looking back, those handwritten notes weren't inefficient. They were grounding. They required us to slow down, to engage, and to stay present in our responsibilities. There's something steady about that kind of life, something we didn't realize we'd miss until it was gone. Waiting was an inseparable part of life in the 1970s, and nowhere was that more apparent than with handwritten notes. Sending a letter was an act of faith. You wrote carefully, folding the paper just right, sealing it in an envelope, addressing it with neat handwriting, sometimes adding a small doodle or a flourish of personality that hinted at your mood. Then, you put it in the mailbox and walked away, leaving it to travel across streets, cities, or even states before it reached the person you were thinking of. There was no instant reply, no read receipt or immediate reaction. That silence was not empty. It was full of imagination and suspense. I remember pacing my small bedroom, my eyes occasionally drifting to the calendar on the wall, marking the days with a pencil, not obsessively, but with quiet anticipation. The creaking of the floorboards outside my room, the distant rumble of a car on our street, the faint sound of someone mowing their lawn down the block, all of it became part of the waiting experience, almost like the background music of my patience. Each day, I would glance at the mailbox from the window, hoping that familiar metal clank would signal a response. And when it finally did, even if it was just a thin envelope, the thrill was immediate. I remember walking outside, picking it up, feeling the weight of the paper in my hands, noticing the subtle bends and the familiar slant of the handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I held it, turned it over, inspected it like it was a precious artifact, feeling a mix of anxiety, excitement, and hope. The act of waiting, of letting the days stretch between the sending and the receiving, made the eventual reading feel monumental. Every word mattered. A single sentence could change the tone of your week, alter your thoughts, or bring a quiet smile to your face that lasted hours. Today, that kind of experience is almost impossible. Messages arrive instantly, expectations are immediate, and silence is often misinterpreted as indifference or rejection. Back then, silence was normal. Waiting was part of the rhythm of life. It taught us patience, empathy, and emotional resilience in ways that the instantaneous, fleeting messages of today cannot. Handwritten notes also forced introspection. I had to think carefully about what I wanted to communicate, because once a message left my hands, it was no longer mine. There was no way to delete it, edit it, or add clarifications. I remember one particular letter to a close friend, written late at night, with the window cracked open, the smell of freshly cut grass drifting in from the yard below, crickets chirping outside. I paused multiple times, looking up at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of a car down the street, making sure every word was exactly what I wanted to say. When I finally folded it, the act felt almost sacred. That kind of attention to words is almost unimaginable now. Even arguments and apologies were shaped by this slow, deliberate process. If you were upset, you might write a letter, leave it to rest for a day, and then send it, giving both parties a chance to cool down. That delay often prevented misunderstandings from escalating. Today, anger can be transmitted instantly, often leaving regrets in its wake. Back then, ink on paper demanded reflection, consideration, and restraint. I learned to live with my words, to let others live with them, and in doing so, we built trust, patience, and emotional depth. The waiting was a lesson in itself. It stretched time, it slowed life down, and it forced you to notice the small details, the creases in the envelope, the faint perfume on a page, the slight smudge of ink from nervous fingers. Each one of these things added texture, life, and intimacy to communication. Sitting here now, in a world filled with instant messages and ephemeral notifications, I can't help but feel a longing for that kind of tangible, deliberate connection. In the 1970s, handwritten notes weren't just words on paper. They were emotional lifelines, quiet anchors in a fast-moving world, and teachers of patience, empathy, and reflection. And that lesson, perhaps more than anything, is what I miss most when I look back. One of the most vivid memories I have from the 1970s is the way handwritten notes shaped our friendships and social lives. In a world without smartphones or instant messaging, passing a note wasn't just a convenience, it was an art form. I remember the hallways of my high school, the smell of floor polish and chalk dust lingering in the air, sunlight filtering through tall windows and casting long stripes across the linoleum. Friends would sit at their desks, hands hovering over folded pieces of paper, waiting for the perfect moment to slide them across the wooden tops. Each note was carefully folded, sometimes into tiny squares or long rectangles, depending on how much needed to be said. "Meet me at the park after school," one would say. "Don't forget the movie tickets," another might whisper across the paper. The thrill wasn't just in the words themselves, it was in the secrecy, the timing, the way you had to trust the other person to read it discreetly and respond appropriately. I can still picture myself clutching a small square of notebook paper, my palms sweaty, heart racing, waiting until the teacher's back was turned before nudging it toward a friend across the aisle. That tactile experience, feeling the paper, seeing the ink, sometimes noticing little doodles in the margins, created a connection that no text message could replicate. There was intimacy in the handwriting, a reflection of the writer's personality and mood. Sometimes, a note was playful, filled with jokes or inside references only the two of you understood. Other times, it carried a confession, an apology, a heartfelt thank you. Receiving it was like holding a piece of someone's mind and heart in your own hands. Even outside school, the exchange of handwritten notes kept our social worlds alive. Birthday invitations were written by hand. RSVP notes returned in envelopes with a small flourish or decorative sticker. Party planning involved carefully folded lists and reminders passed among friends. And when someone was sick or absent, a short, neatly written message could bridge the distance, bring in comfort and connection. I remember walking home from the post office, letters from friends and relatives clutched in my hand, the sun warm on my back, and feeling a quiet sense of anticipation about the stories and emotions waiting inside each envelope. These notes weren't ephemeral. They lasted, saved in shoeboxes or desk drawers. They became time capsules, preserving not just words but memories, smells, and the feeling of a particular moment in our lives. Today, messages disappear in seconds, lost in the endless digital flow. Back then, the effort it took to write, send, and wait for a note imbued every communication with meaning. I can't overstate how different life felt because of it. The simple act of writing and receiving handwritten notes taught us patience, attention, and care. Every word mattered, every crease and smudge carried emotion, and every moment of anticipation made the connection deeper. In a world where instant everything dominates, I sometimes long for that deliberate, slow, and meaningful way of connecting, a time when human touch, even through pen and paper, mattered more than speed. There's something about the smell of paper and ink that instantly takes me back to the 1970s. I remember sitting at my small bedroom desk, the lamp casting a warm glow over the lined pages before me, the faint aroma of old books and the subtle metallic temps of the ink from my fountain pen filling the air. That desk was my sanctuary, a place where thoughts became tangible and emotions found form. I would write to friends, family, and even people I barely knew, spending hours carefully choosing each word, crossing out mistakes, and sometimes starting over completely because the sentence didn't feel right. The slow rhythm of writing forced reflection. Today, we type quickly, delete, and send, often without much thought. But back then, you were compelled to consider every syllable, every pause, every phrase. Handwritten notes taught us patience, mindfulness, and the art of observation. I remember one summer afternoon, sitting on the porch with the notebook balanced on my knees, the cicadas buzzing in the trees above, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. I was writing a letter to a friend who had moved several states away, picturing her reading it, imagining her smile, imagining the sound of her laughter when she read a funny line I had included. That anticipation gave life to the act of writing. Even errands and daily routines carried handwritten communication. Grocery lists jotted on scraps of paper, reminders tucked into coat pockets, Messages left for siblings or parents on the kitchen counter, they weren't mere instructions. They were small acts of care, silent acknowledgments that someone thought enough to take the time to write. Each note became a piece of the rhythm of our lives, connecting the quiet moments of the day. And when you finally received a reply, whether a letter or a small note tucked into your locker or slipped under your bedroom door, the joy was immediate and profound. You held it in your hands, felt the texture of the paper, noticed the indentations of the pen, maybe even caught the faint scent of the writer's home or perfume. That physicality of communication made every message intimate, alive, and unforgettable. Today, messages vanish into the digital ether, lacking the permanence, the personal touch, and the emotional weight that handwritten notes carried. Looking back, I realized that these simple papers shaped who we were. They taught us to slow down, to feel deeply, and to appreciate the effort and presence of others. Life moved at a different pace then, and in that pace, connections were richer, emotions more palpable, and memories far more vivid. Writing, waiting, and receiving these notes were not just about communication, they were about living, feeling, and understanding the people around us in ways screens can never replicate. Every crease, every smudge, every careful word told a story that still lingers with me today. Even the smallest interactions in the 1970s revolved around handwritten notes, and looking back now, I realize just how much they shaped the texture of everyday life. I remember afternoons spent in my neighborhood, walking down tree-lined streets where the air smelled faintly of cut grass and warm asphalt, carrying a folded note in my pocket like a secret treasure. Every step felt purposeful, because I knew that momentary act of delivery was about more than words. It was about presence, care, and connection. Passing a note to a friend on the porch steps, slipping it under a neighbor's door, or leaving a small message at a corner store required attention to detail. I would pause before slipping the paper into a mailbox, imagining who would find it, how their eyes would skim the words, and whether my handwriting would reveal my mood or personality. There was a rhythm to it, a deliberate cadence that demanded patience and mindfulness. Even the mundane became rich. Birthday cards weren't purchased and hastily signed, they were chosen carefully. The inside messages thoughtfully composed, often accompanied by a few lines of personal reflection, jokes, or sketches. I remember my father, pen in hand, jotting notes to relatives far away, the scratch of the pen mixing with the scent of coffee in the kitchen, while my mother folded a stack of letters from her own friends. The entire household hummed with quiet purpose, a soft orchestra of ink meeting paper. School life was no different. Notes exchanged between classmates carried weight and suspense. A folded piece of notebook paper slid across a desk could contain a secret, a confession, or an invitation, and the act of passing it demanded strategy and patience. I can still see the fluorescent lights reflecting off the linoleum floors, the faint scent of chalk dust lingering in the air, the murmur of conversations in the hallways, and the careful glances we took to make sure the teacher didn't notice. Each note was a miniature story, a contained moment that connected us, held tension, or sparked joy. The anticipation of opening a letter at home was equally profound. I remember walking in from school, feeling the envelope in my hand, its texture telling me everything I needed to know before I even read a word. I would sit at the kitchen table, unfold the paper slowly, and inhale the subtle scents: perfume, ink, paper, all carrying the invisible presence of the writer. Every crease and smudge became a part of the message, adding weight and personality that a digital screen could never replicate. Even adult communication relied on handwritten notes. Businesses, neighbors, and friends all depended on paper for reminders, invitations, and messages that required careful thought. You couldn't simply ignore a note. It existed physically in the world, demanding acknowledgement. That tangibility taught accountability, mindfulness, and respect. In contrast, today's messages are fleeting, disposable, and often overlooked. Back then, we lived in a slower, more deliberate world, where communication carried layers of emotion and intention. Handwritten notes were not just letters, they were experiences, teaching patience, empathy, and attention. They anchored us in our relationships, connected our communities, and left a tangible trace of our presence that lasted long after the words were read. Every folded paper, every line of ink, every careful word was a marker of time, thought, and feeling. And even now, decades later, I can feel the weight of them in my hands, and the echoes of their presence in my heart. One of the aspects of handwritten notes that always strikes me when I look back is how deeply they shaped the rhythm of our daily lives. In the 1970s, even the simplest tasks were tied to the act of writing, of leaving a tangible trace of your thoughts or plans. I remember mornings at the kitchen table, the sunlight pouring through lace curtains, dust motes floating lazily in the golden light. My mother would leave me a note, written neatly on a small piece of paper, tucked under the salt shaker or clipped to the edge of the breakfast menu. Don't forget your library books, one might say. Walk the dog before dinner. Sometimes she would add little doodles, a heart, a smiley face, a tiny star, and even those small additions carried personality, warmth, and care. My father, on the other hand, preferred to write on scraps of scratch paper. Notes sometimes hastily scribbled, but always precise in meaning. Pick up milk on your way home. Check the garage door. Even these functional notes had a weight to them because they were real, physical items that could not be ignored. There was no delete button, no accidental dismissal, no tiny notification that could be swiped away. They demanded your attention. I can recall afternoons walking through the neighborhood with friends, carrying a folded note of some secret message between us. We would time the delivery carefully, choosing the right moment to slip it into a locker, hand it over discreetly at the bus stop, or leave it under a bedroom door. Every folded crease mattered. Every smudge of pencil or pen became part of the story. Passing notes in school was an art form in itself, one that required patience, subtlety, and a shared understanding that the moment mattered. The classroom smelled of chalk, floor polish, and faintly of cafeteria food wafting in from the hallway. And each time a note exchanged hands, it was an electric spark in that controlled environment. Beyond school, the postal service carried our emotions across cities and states. Letters mailed to faraway friends or relatives took days, sometimes weeks, to arrive. I remember checking the mailbox almost obsessively, feeling a subtle thrill with each piece of mail I retrieved. When a letter arrived, I would sit down at the kitchen table, unfold it slowly, and savor the texture of the paper, the impression of the writer's handwriting, the faint aroma of ink and maybe perfume or cigarette smoke lingering from its journey. That moment, that small ritual, made each message a memorable experience. Even arguments or apologies were transformed by handwriting. You took your time, thinking through each word, knowing it could not be unsent, that it would carry your presence and intentions in a way that could not be replicated digitally. In today's world, our words disappear instantly. A single text can be ignored or forgotten. In the 1970s, a single note could last decades, preserved in shoeboxes, journals, or drawers, reminding us of a moment, a feeling, a person, long after the ink had dried. Handwritten communication taught us patience, mindfulness, and emotional depth. Every note was a tangible piece of someone's life, and every message received anchored relationships, connected communities, and left a permanent mark on memory. Even now, decades later, the weight of those folded pages and the presence of those handwritten words remain vivid in my mind, a testament to a slower, more deliberate, and deeply human way of connecting with one another. Handwritten notes shaped our sense of intimacy and connection in ways that are almost unimaginable today. I remember afternoons in the 1970s when the air was thick with the scent of summer freshly cut grass, asphalt warming under the sun, and the faint, comforting aroma of home-cooked meals drifting from open windows. I would sit on my front porch with a notebook balanced on my knees, pen in hand, carefully composing a letter to a friend or a distant relative. Each word mattered. I would pause, glance around the quiet street, listening to the hum of a passing car or the distant laughter of children playing kickball in the neighborhood, and then continue writing, aware that every sentence I penned would carry my presence, my mood, and my intent. Even simple notes could feel monumental. A small folded piece of paper slipped into a friend's locker could contain a confession, an inside joke, or a heartfelt apology, and the act of writing it made the emotion tangible in a way that modern digital messages rarely achieve. Passing notes in school was an intricate dance. You had to time the moment precisely, make sure the teacher's attention was elsewhere, and trust the recipient to handle it with care. Every crease, every tiny smudge of pencil or ink, became a subtle signature of personality and intent. At home, notes carried a different kind of weight. My parents left messages on the refrigerator or kitchen counter, practical instructions that were also acts of thoughtfulness. Dinner at 6. Remember to water the plants, or call Aunt Margaret. Even in their brevity, these notes spoke volumes about attention, care, and shared responsibility. When relatives wrote letters from afar, the experience deepened. I would wait days, sometimes weeks, for a reply, marking each passing day on a small calendar. That wait allowed the imagination to wander. I pictured them reading my words, sitting at their own kitchen table, perhaps listening to a radio show in the background, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, the same way it did in my own home. That anticipation made the arrival of a letter electric. I would hold it in my hands, turning it over slowly, feeling the texture of the paper, noting the faint impressions of the pen, sometimes catching the subtle scent of ink, perfume, or even a hint of smoke. Each note was a tangible bridge between lives separated by distance, a physical manifestation of thoughtfulness that lingered long after the words were read. Handwritten communication also taught patience and reflection. If you were upset or nervous, you had to choose your words carefully, because, once sent, they could not be unsent. You had to live with your choices and trust the other person to do the same. That sense of responsibility shaped how we approached relationships and built emotional resilience. Today, messages are instantaneous, ephemeral, and often forgotten within seconds. In contrast, every handwritten note from the 1970s was a living artifact, a permanent record of presence, emotion, and intention. They anchored friendships, connected families, and taught lessons about care, patience, and empathy that are difficult to replicate in the modern digital age. Decades later, I still feel the weight of those notes in my hands, the texture of the paper under my fingers, and the echo of the words in my memory, a reminder of a slower, more deliberate, and deeply human way of living and connecting. One of the things I miss most about the 1970s is how handwritten notes created a sense of anticipation and presence that no digital message today can replicate. I remember sitting at my bedroom desk on a warm summer evening, the soft golden light of a lamp illuminating the lined notebook in front of me, the faint scent of old books and the subtle metallic temps of ink filling the air. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood distant lawnmowers, the occasional car passing by, children laughing and playing blended into a comforting backdrop. Each note I wrote required thought and reflection. I would pause, tapping the pen against the paper, listening to the world around me, imagining the recipient reading my words, picturing their expressions, and feeling the anticipation of their eventual response. Handwritten notes made communication deliberate, almost ceremonial. A single piece of paper could carry weight beyond the words it contained. I remember exchanging folded notes with friends at school, timing each movement with precision, glancing around to ensure the teacher's attention was elsewhere, and trusting that the recipient would read and respond carefully. Every crease in the paper, every smudge or indentation of the pen became part of the message itself, carrying subtle nuances of personality and emotion. At home, notes created connection in equally powerful ways. My parents left messages on the kitchen counter, clipped to the edge of the refrigerator, or tucked under a coffee mug, offering guidance, reminders, or small acts of care. Dinner's ready at 6. Take care, walking to the store. Call grandma. Even in their simplicity, these notes conveyed presence, responsibility, and consideration. Mailing letters to relatives or friends who lived far away added another dimension. I would take a folded letter to the post office, the envelope slightly worn from careful handling, and drop it into the box, knowing it would take days to arrive. The waiting period was as meaningful as the letter itself. It allowed anticipation to grow, emotions to mature, and reflection to deepen. When a reply finally arrived, it was an event. I would hold the envelope, examine the handwriting, sense the slight fragrance of the sender's environment, and carefully unfold it. Reading the words became a ritual, a deeply immersive experience that filled me with connection and presence. Even minor notes, thankers, apologies, or invitations carried weight and permanence. They taught responsibility and care because their physicality demanded attention and their content could not be instantly corrected or deleted. In today's world of instantaneous messaging, communication has lost that deliberate pacing and tangible intimacy. Digital messages arrive and vanish, rarely leaving a lasting impression. In contrast, every handwritten note from the 1970s left a tangible mark, not just on paper, but on memory and relationships. Each crease, each smudge, each carefully chosen word became a piece of our lives, a reflection of our thoughts and emotions, and a bridge between people. I can still feel the texture of those papers under my fingers, the imprint of handwriting etched in my memory, and the echoes of those words in my heart a reminder of a slower, more mindful, and profoundly human way of living and connecting. Looking back, I realize that handwritten notes in the 1970s were far more than just messages. They were extensions of ourselves, reflections of personality, mood, and intention. I remember summer evenings spent sitting on the front porch, notebook balanced on my knees, pen in hand, composing letters to friends who had moved to different towns or states. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of a car engine along our quiet street. Birds chirped lazily, and occasionally the wind rustled through the leaves of the old oak trees lining the avenue. Every word I wrote was chosen carefully, every sentence crafted to convey not just information, but emotion and presence. Even mistakes mattered. A smudge of ink or a corrected word added a human touch that made the letter feel alive. At school, passing notes had its own rhythm, almost like a silent choreography. You had to know the timing, the right angle, the exact moment when the teacher's back was turned. Each note was folded in a particular way, sometimes into squares, sometimes into long rectangles, each crease a silent signature. The words inside could spark laughter, convey secrets, or express feelings that might never have been spoken aloud. I can still recall the faint smell of pencil erasers and chalk dust in the hallways, the soft squeak of sneakers on linoleum floors, and the subtle excitement that traveled through the air as notes exchanged hands. At home, notes were embedded into everyday life, bridging the gaps created by family members' busy schedules. My mother would leave reminders on the kitchen counter: dinner at 6, don't forget your homework, or call Aunt Margaret. Even simple instructions carried warmth, care, and a sense of presence. My father, ever practical, scribbled notes on scraps of paper: check garage door, pick up milk. These small gestures grounded our daily lives, reinforcing trust, responsibility, and connection. Mailing letters added a layer of anticipation that is hard to imagine today. I remember folding a letter, tucking it into an envelope, and walking to the mailbox with a sense of purpose and excitement. The days that followed were filled with subtle observation, listening for the mail truck, scanning the street, imagining the recipient opening the letter, perhaps sitting at their own kitchen table with sunlight filtering through the curtains, the faint aroma of coffee or soap in the air. That anticipation enriched the experience, making every word feel meaningful and every response a small celebration. Even apologies or difficult conversations were shaped by the deliberate pace of handwriting. You were forced to consider your words, to pause and reflect, because once sent, they could not be recalled or edited. That discipline shaped relationships, teaching patience, empathy, and emotional responsibility. Unlike today, where messages are instantaneous and fleeting, the handwritten notes of the 1970s were enduring, tangible, and deeply personal. They anchored relationships, connected distant friends and family, and left a lasting imprint on memory. Decades later, I can still feel the texture of the paper beneath my fingers, the subtle impressions of the pen, and the quiet, profound intimacy of a message sent and received with care. Those notes remind me that communication can be more than speed. It can be presence, reflection, and love, captured forever in ink, on paper. One of the most unforgettable aspects of handwritten notes in the 1970s was how they created a bridge between distance and presence, making faraway friends, relatives, and even acquaintances feel intimately close. I remember summer afternoons in our neighborhood, the sun warming the sidewalks, the faint scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers hanging in the air. I would sit at the small desk in my bedroom, pen in hand, careful not to smudge the ink, folding a sheet of paper into a perfect rectangle before tucking it into an envelope. The process itself felt sacred, as if each crease and line of my handwriting carried a fragment of my personality, my mood, and my intentions. I would pause often, listening to the distant hum of a car or the playful shouts of children down the street, imagining the recipient reading my words, imagining their reactions, and letting that anticipation fill the space around me. The act of writing demanded thoughtfulness. Every sentence mattered. I had to consider tone, clarity, and emotion, because once the note left my hands, it was out of my control. That sense of responsibility shaped how we communicated, teaching patience, mindfulness, and empathy. Passing notes at school added a layer of thrill and strategy to this experience. The hallway smelled faintly of chalk and floor polish, and the low murmur of students talking, mixed with the distant echoes of lockers slamming shut. I would slide a carefully folded note across a desk or sneak it into a locker, my heart racing with anticipation. The note itself could contain anything: an apology, a secret, a joke, or an invitation, and the weight it carried was amplified by the deliberate care involved in its delivery. At home, notes were equally significant, whether left on the kitchen counter, pinned to the refrigerator, or tucked under a coffee mug. My parents used them for practical purposes. Yes, reminders about dinner, chores, or errands, but even those carried warmth, thoughtfulness, and a sense of personal connection. Each note was a tangible signal of care, a reminder that someone had paused in their day to communicate with you in a meaningful, deliberate way. Mailing letters to relatives or friends who lived far away was another ritual altogether. I can remember walking to the mailbox with the envelope in hand, the weight of the paper and the penmanship within making it feel important. For days afterward, I would check the mailbox obsessively, imagining the recipient opening the letter, perhaps at their kitchen table, with sunlight streaming through their window, the faint aroma of coffee or freshly baked bread around them. That anticipation enriched the emotional experience of communication, making the eventual reply feel like a small celebration. Even difficult conversations, apologies, confessions, or explanations benefited from the deliberate pace of handwriting. You had to carefully choose each word, knowing it could not be unsent, deleted, or instantly corrected. That discipline shaped character, empathy, and emotional responsibility in a way that instant digital messaging cannot replicate. Looking back, I realized that every crisp S, every smudge, every carefully chosen word of a handwritten note anchored relationships, built trust, and created memories that last decades. The 1970s were a slower, more deliberate, and more human era of communication, where the physicality of pen and paper transformed simple words into enduring connections. Those notes, now yellowed and worn with age, remain alive in my memory, a testament to patience, care, and the quiet power of human presence. Another memory that stands out from the 1970s is how handwritten notes shaped our courtship and friendships, infusing every interaction with intimacy and care. I remember the evenings I would spend sitting at my small desk in the corner of my bedroom, the orange glow of a desk lamp illuminating the lined pages before me, the faint scent of ink mixing with the warm, dusty aroma of old books stacked nearby. Outside, the world moved at a slower rhythm. Cars hummed softly along sun-warmed streets, the occasional bicycle bell rang in the distance, and the air carried the subtle fragrances of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. I would fold my letters meticulously, pressing the creases flat so they would fit perfectly into the envelope, and carefully seal it, as though the act itself imbued the words with extra meaning. Writing wasn't just about sharing information, it was about presence, about reaching across time and space to convey emotion and personality. The anticipation of sending a note made the moment electric. I would imagine the recipient holding the paper, feeling the texture of the page, noticing the slight indentations of my pen, perhaps smelling the faint trace of ink and home on the envelope. That imagination carried a weight that modern instant messaging cannot replicate. At school, passing notes was its own delicate choreography. Hallways smelled faintly of chalk, floor polish, and the occasional waft of cafeteria food. I would time the moment perfectly, waiting for the teacher to turn her back, or for a lull in the hallway chatter. The folded paper would move from hand to hand, sometimes whispered about, sometimes laughed over, each crease and doodle in the margins revealing a secret personality, a joke, or a hidden sentiment. These exchanges were a quiet thrill, an intimate dance of attention, trust, and careful timing. At home, notes carried a different kind of intimacy. My parents used them for guidance and reminders. Don't forget your piano lesson, dinner at 7, or call Aunt Margaret. Even the most mundane messages carried warmth, attention, and care. They created a sense of connection that extended beyond the immediate moment, grounding us in a shared rhythm of daily life. Mailing letters to friends and relatives far away was even more profound. I remember walking to the mailbox, envelope in hand, feeling the weight and importance of each letter. The days that followed were filled with quiet anticipation, imagining the recipient unfolding the note, reading the words slowly, savoring the experience the way I had while writing it. Even apologies, confessions, and declarations of affection were transformed by the deliberate pace of handwriting. Each word was chosen with care, each sentence considered, knowing that it would endure in physical form, tangible, permanent, and memorable. In today's world of instantaneous messaging, that sense of gravity and reflection is nearly impossible to replicate. Back then, communication was a practice of patience, mindfulness, and emotional presence. Handwritten notes anchored relationships, built trust, and created memories that endured decades. The slight smudges of ink, the faint creases, and the careful folds all remain vivid in my memory, echoing a slower, more deliberate, and deeply human era of connection that screens and instant messages can never fully replace. One of the things I often reflect on when thinking about the 1970s is how handwritten notes taught us patience, empathy, and emotional intelligence in ways that today's instant communication simply cannot. I remember quiet Sunday afternoons, sitting at the old wooden desk in my bedroom, the sunlight filtering through the half-open curtains, the faint scent of polished floorboards and old paper filling the room. My pen would glide across the lined pages as I composed letters to friends and relatives who lived far away, carefully choosing every word, crossing out mistakes, and sometimes starting over entirely because a sentence didn't feel quite right. The act of writing was meditative, a moment to slow down, reflect, and connect. Outside, the world moved at a different pace. The distant hum of a car on the street, the faint chirping of birds, the occasional squeak of a bicycle passing by all became part of the rhythm of my writing. I would fold each note with care, making sure the edges aligned perfectly, and tuck it into an envelope, imagining the journey it would take and the anticipation it would create for the recipient. Even the most mundane notes carried weight. A folded piece of paper slid into a friend's locker could contain anything: a secret, a joke, an apology, or an invitation, and the care with which it was written made the moment of receipt electric. At home, notes bridged the gaps created by busy family schedules. My mother would leave reminders on the kitchen counter or clip them to the edge of the refrigerator. Dinner at 6, walk the dog, call grandma. My father scribbled practical notes on scraps of paper, pick up milk, check garage door. These small gestures were imbued with thoughtfulness and presence, teaching us to notice, respect, and respond to the people around us. Mailing letters added another layer of anticipation. I would carry the envelope to the mailbox, feeling the weight of the paper and imagining the recipient holding it, unfolding it slowly, perhaps sitting at their own kitchen table with sunlight streaming through the window, the faint aroma of coffee or baked bread in the air. Days of waiting were part of the experience, shaping the emotional landscape of communication. Even difficult messages, confessions, apologies, or expressions of love benefited from the deliberate pace of handwriting. Each word was chosen carefully, each sentence measured, because once sent, it could not be retracted or edited. That process instilled discipline, reflection, and empathy. Today, messages arrive instantly, often fleeting and ephemeral, lacking the depth, permanence, and presence that a handwritten note offered. Back then, every crease, every smudge, every carefully chosen word anchored relationships, built trust, and created memories that could last decades. I still feel the texture of those letters under my fingers, the impressions of the pen, and the lingering echoes of the writer's presence. Handwritten notes were not merely communication, they were a form of art, a ritual of connection, and a profound expression of humanity. Even now, long after the ink has faded and the paper has yellowed, the lessons they imparted, the patience, the attentiveness, the emotional depth remain alive, reminding me of a time when connecting with others required intention, care, and presence, a stark contrast to the fleeting, disposable messages of today. As I sit here now, decades later, I can't help but feel a deep sense of nostalgia for the world of handwritten notes in the 1970s, a world that demanded patience, presence, and care, and rewarded it with intimacy, connection, and lasting memories. I remember the evenings spent at my bedroom desk, the soft lamplight illuminating the lined paper before me, the faint aroma of ink blending with the dust and warmth of the room. Outside, cicadas buzzed, the distant hum of a car drifted along the quiet street, and the occasional laughter of children playing kickball reminded me that life moved at a rhythm that allowed reflection, anticipation, and savoring of small joys. Folding a letter, tucking it into an envelope, sealing it carefully, it was more than a ritual. It was a tangible extension of myself, my emotions, and my intentions. Every crease, every smudge, every carefully chosen word conveyed presence and personality, teaching lessons about empathy, patience, and emotional responsibility. I can still picture the thrill of passing a note at school, timing each movement perfectly, glancing around to make sure the teacher's back was turned, feeling the paper slide across a desk into a friend's hands. The hallways smelled faintly of chalk and floor polish, and every small interaction carried weight, shaping relationships in ways that modern digital communication cannot replicate. At home, handwritten notes connected family members across the daily routines. Reminders, invitations, or simple messages of care were infused with warmth and thoughtfulness. Mailing letters added another layer of anticipation and excitement. Days of waiting made each response feel monumental. Every returned note a small celebration of connection. Even confessions, apologies, and expressions of affection were transformed by the deliberate, careful pace of handwriting. Today, messages disappear almost as soon as they are sent, ephemeral and fleeting, leaving little room for reflection, mindfulness, or deep emotional resonance. Looking back, I realized that handwritten notes were more than communication. They were a form of art, a ritual, a bridge between hearts and minds. They anchored relationships, nurtured patience, and created memories that last a lifetime. And though technology has changed how we connect, the lessons of those letters remain invaluable. I encourage you to pause, to savor the act of writing or even receiving a message with intention, and to remember that connection is not measured by speed, but by care, thoughtfulness, and presence. If this story of life in 1970s America and the magic of handwritten notes resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the past, and leave a comment sharing your favorite memory of notes, letters, or personal connections from your own life. Let's keep the spirit of these heartfelt communications alive together, one story at a time.